don't you think? Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us here at Heritage. As Director of Lectures and Seminars, it's my privilege to welcome everyone to our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium, and of course to welcome those who join us on each occasion on our heritage.org website. We would ask everyone in-house to make that last courtesy check that cell phones have been turned off as we begin. And I will remind everyone, too, that we will host the program within 24 hours on our website for everyone's future reference. Our Internet viewers, of course, are always welcome to send comments or questions to us via email, simply addressing us at speaker@heritage.org. Hosting our discussion this morning is David Kreutzer. Dr. Kreutzer is our Senior Policy Analyst in Energy Economics and Climate Change in our Center for Data Analysis. He researches how energy and climate change legislation will affect economic activity at national, local, and industry levels. His work has been featured in several journals: the Journal of Political Economy, the National Tax Journal, Economic Inquiry, the Southern Economic Journal, and the Journal of Energy and Development. Before joining Heritage, he was an economist at Berman & Company. From 1984 to 2007, he taught economics at James Madison University in Harrisonburg, Virginia, where he also served as director of the International Business Program. Please join me in welcoming my colleague, David Kreutzer. David?
Thank you, John. Thank you all very much for showing up. Subsequent to our announcing this panel, it seemed like such a good idea that the Department of Interior is also having one today. So Heritage picked first, so we have the varsity team. Hydraulic fracturing and directional drilling combined to dramatically increase the reserves of natural gas. The technology exists to extract these reserves. Among the remaining questions are, can we extract them safely, and will regulators block access? To help sort things out, we have a distinguished panel each of whom has at least 3 decades of experience in these policy areas. In order of appearance, they are Scott Anderson. He is Senior Policy Advisor at the Environmental Defense Fund's Climate and Air Program. He has been very active in oil and gas issues for several decades. In addition to membership on many other advisory groups, Scott is or has been a member of the Governing Council of the State Bar of Texas's Oil, Gas, and Mineral Law Section, the Groundwater Protection Council's Carbon Dioxide Sequestration Committee, the World Resources Institute Stakeholder Group on Carbon Capture and Sequestration, the Texas Oilfield Cleanup Fund Advisory Committee, and the National Petroleum Council Environment and Regulatory Subgroup. He has a law degree from the University of Texas and was former editor of the Texas International Law Journal. Mark Boling is Executive Vice President and General Counsel of Southwestern Energy Company. Prior to joining Southwestern in January of 2002, he was in private practice in Houston, Texas, specializing in oil and gas transactional work. Before that, he was a partner with the law firm of Fulbright and Jaworski, practicing in their oil and gas department. He is a member of the American Bar Association's Environment, Energy, and Resources and Business Law sections, the Arkansas Bar Association's Natural Resources Law section, and the State Bar of Texas's Oil, Gas, and Mineral Law and Corporate Counsel sections. Mark has a law degree from Southern Methodist University and a Bachelor of Science degree in Geology from DePauw University. That's the one in Greencastle, Indiana. Lee Fuller is Vice President of Government Relations at the Independent Petroleum Association of America, where he has been since 1988. Lee served on the U.S. Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works from 1978 through 1986, including 2 years as Minority Staff Director for Senator Lloyd Bentsen. In the decades to follow, Lee worked on such policy issues as oil and gas production wastes, the application of Superfund to oil and gas production facilities, the Clean Air Act as it relates to oil and gas production. Before coming to Washington, Lee worked for Exxon in technical support and environmental compliance at their Baytown, Texas refinery. He has a chemical engineering degree from Lehigh University. They will speak from 12 to 15 minutes with a few extra minutes for Scott, who's going to give an overview. And we hope to have time for some questions afterwards, but please welcome the panel.
The risk of having 3 lawyers on the program is that the English major was selected in order to give the technical overview of hydraulic fracturing. So, Scott Anderson with Environmental Defense Fund. I wanted to start out by saying a little bit about EDF. EDF was founded in 1967 as part of the campaign to phase out the use of DDT. We were founded on Long Island. Excuse me again. As I understand it from the folklore of the organization, our initial slogan was "Sue the so-and-sos." Somewhere along the line, our slogan changed, and on the bottom of our business cards now it says "Finding the ways that work." And we are known for working with businesses for win-win solutions to environmental problems, and also known for harnessing market forces with the aim of solving environmental problems. What I want to do today is give you that tutorial on hydraulic fracturing. I promise it'll be short. And then also give you some takeaway points. At first I thought I would have like 3 takeaway points, but then it was 4, 5, 6. I now have 7 takeaway points, so may have to go over them a couple of times. Hydraulic fracturing. So hydraulic fracturing is only a process within a larger process. It's the portion of the drilling and completion of wells that occurs at a certain point. And it's important to understand this because people use the term hydraulic fracturing really in all kinds of ways, including sometimes as a synonym for drilling itself, as a synonym even for natural gas development itself. But technically, hydraulic fracturing is only a portion of that drilling and completion process. So this is the English major's version of how this happens. First, you drill a well, and you make the well bore as straight as possible. Then you put pipe in the well, and you use some things called centralizers to make the pipe as straight as possible. The reason you want that pipe as straight as possible and the well as straight as possible is because you need to get a good cement job. How do you get a good cement job? Well, all kinds of ways. Everything from buying the right kind of cement to mixing the cement correctly, to pumping it down the hole correctly, to letting it have enough setup time so that it reaches the proper technical specifications. And then in some circumstances to do some analysis on the cement, and if you didn't get it right the first time, then you fix it. That's basically cementing. And the reason cementing is important is because it goes on the outside of that pipe that's hopefully centered in the hole, and it forms a barrier, if it works right, between the outside of that pipe and the formation, the actual rock. And then in most cases, the cement is circulated down that space and then comes back up what's called the annulus, the space that's on the inside of that pipe. And there's an annulus there because usually there's a second string of smaller diameter pipe. So you want the cement on the outside and the inside. And if the cement's done correctly, which sometimes it's not, but if the cement's done correctly, then that keeps fluids, gas, chemicals that are down low from coming up through that space. And that way, whatever comes out of the well is, in theory, coming out, right where you want it, so that you can do with it what you want to do. Okay, so now you have this hole with this absolutely perfect cement job, right? In the case of a big shale well, you've also got a horizontal. They've got technology that allows a slow bend. So far I've just talked about the straight part of the well. But in order to do horizontal drilling, which is what you need in order to develop shale plays, you've got to curve that well and then go out in a horizontal direction, which can be a mile or two in a horizontal direction. So now you've got your well, everything's perfect, of course, and it's time to get ready to do your hydraulic fracturing. Before you can do the hydraulic fracturing, you've got to poke holes, in the pipe, in the places where you've decided you want to create fractures. And you're not really poking holes. You have a little explosive device that blows these holes to hit the places you want them. And then you're finally ready to do hydraulic fracturing. So hydraulic fracturing, again, for shale gas wells, which what order of magnitude or so larger fracs than old conventional frac jobs, require millions of gallons of water. Most of the frac fluid is water, but by no means all. You have water, and you have some sort of proppant, either sand or manufactured beads of some sort, and then you have some chemicals. Lee Fuller would like to point out, just percentage-wise, just how few chemicals there are by volume. But I like to think about the chemicals a lot. In New York's recent environmental impact statement, they identified as many as 266 chemicals that have been used at some place at some time in hydraulic fracturing. We believe that the vast majority of those are rarely, if ever, used these days, but there's probably 30, 40, 50 commonly used chemicals, and most of those are not things you want to drink. We've analyzed those 266 chemicals against 21 toxicity databases, and most of it is not good stuff. So we don't want these chemicals in our water, on our ground, or in our bodies, or even on our skin for the most part. So back to hydraulic fracturing. There's these millions of gallons of water, the sand or other proppant, and a mixture of chemicals are pumped down the hole at very high pressure, and those perforations I referred to are places where all this highly pressured mix comes out of the hole at such force that it actually creates fractures, which can go as far as hundreds of feet in the rock formation, and then the sand or other proppant helps keep those fractures open, and that's when the gas comes and people make millions of dollars. So that's hydraulic fracturing. The chemicals vary from place to place. I understand there are some circumstances where no chemicals at all are used, just fresh water and sand, but that is the exception. In most cases, there are chemicals used for a number of reasons. They're not using them for no reason. The chemicals cost money. They use acid to clean out a hole. They use biocides to kill germs. They use surfactants. There's corrosion inhibitors, iron control agents, etc. Not every frac job has all of those categories of chemicals, but most frac jobs have several categories of chemicals. And within categories, there's multiple chemicals to choose from. We don't really know. In fact, we don't know what all the chemicals are, because there's no law that requires the chemicals to be identified with the amount of specificity needed in order to do any kind of research into the scientific literature. The only thing, except in the state of Wyoming and soon in Arkansas, the only thing the public has access to is what people feel the need to release on what's called an MSDS sheet. And an MSDS sheet doesn't require the level of detail one needs in order to really know what chemicals you're talking about. More on that at the end. How much time do I have? Okay. So that brings me to my 7 quick takeaway points. The first is that the environmental advantages of gas, which are real, the environmental advantages of gas are likely to not be nearly what a lot of the proponents of natural gas think. There's 2 basic buckets to think about here. One is the greenhouse gas emissions. Methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. The number is escaping me right now, but something like 21, 22 times as potent. If fugitive emissions from the gas production, transportation, and distribution process were to amount to 2%, which a lot of people think they do, if you multiply 2 by 21, you get to a pretty high percentage. People like to say that if you take a modern gas-fired power plant and compare it to a modern coal-fired power plant, that the gas combustion is about 50% less than the coal production. In terms of the CO2 emitted is about 50% as much as a coal plant, which is a number I accept. But if you start backing out 42, 44, 46% of that in order to account for fugitive methane emissions, it's a completely different story. And we don't really know. We haven't really done, and apparently no one has really done a good life cycle analysis of methane emissions in the gas industry and compared that to methane emissions in the coal industry. And until that is done, we really don't have a good handle on how much of an advantage natural gas has in terms of greenhouse effects. Hopefully, one of the things that will be happening in the near future is that the gas industry will do a better job of capturing and selling its fugitive methane emissions. The second reason, I'm still on the first takeaway point. The first takeaway point was that gas is likely to not be as environmentally advantageous as a lot of people think. The other reason for that, besides fugitive methane emissions, is the land use impacts that we're mainly talking about today. The potential for polluting groundwater, landscape fragmentation, lots of infrastructure issues on communities, everything from roads to noise, a number of other issues, and then health problems that can be caused by improper waste disposal and spills. The natural gas industry needs to deal with all those things rather than just glibly saying that we're America's clean burning fuel. The second takeaway point is that people who spend time attacking hydraulic fracturing, people who spend time defending hydraulic fracturing, are failing to come to grips with the unconscionably high number of instances where gas development has had environmental impacts. And I say this because in the vast majority, and some would say all cases, that these impacts have come from things other than hydraulic fracturing, as I defined it earlier, other than that narrow portion of the drilling and completion process that I described. So if we spend all of our time debating hydraulic fracturing, we're missing the vast number of activities that are responsible for the incidents that have been confirmed. Third takeaway point is that hydraulic fracturing can be done safely if certain conditions are satisfied, and only if. It is not an inherently safe process. The cementing that I referred to earlier has to be done right, or there's a risk of stuff coming out of the ground. The casing, the pipes need to be done right. Pressure needs to be managed properly. Ask BP about that. And finally, the process needs to take place in an area where there's a geologic confining zone that's sufficient to make sure that fractures don't come out of the zone of fracturing and into the water table. Fourth takeaway point. We believe at EDF that people can work together to solve these problems. They're, for the most part, not working together these days. But we think many of these environmental impacts can be resolved, and others can and should be minimized. And the only way to get that done is for all stakeholders to come together and work on solutions. Fifth, and when people, if there's going to be any hope of people coming together to work on solutions, both sides are going to need to lower the rhetoric and come together not with an attitude that the other side doesn't know anything, but rather come together willing to listen to the other people's viewpoint. Pretty basic, we all know that, but people need to come forward and listen to the other person's viewpoint, get down to the actual facts, look for actual solutions, commit to solve them, and then follow through on those commitments. Without that kind of process, there's really no point people trying to bridge differences. Sixth takeaway point is that there is a very, very major part of this puzzle that industry and only industry can do. Only the companies can get their own houses in order. And the reason I focus on this is that if you look at the several thousand documented cases where gas development has had an environmental impact that's not acceptable, majority of them are spills. The majority are other accidents. Most of the things that have happened out there are human error, but enough of those human errors have occurred to draw into question whether or not companies are properly managing for their environmental risks. We think companies need to get really serious about upgrading their environmental risk control management systems and doing whatever they need to do in terms of their corporate culture to get the people in the field to actually fit in with those management systems. Which brings me to my final takeaway point, which is this, going back to the chemicals issue. In my opinion, nothing good is going to happen for the natural gas industry in terms of public acceptance or regulation until the gas industry puts behind it this issue about disclosure of frac chemicals. It's not just that the industry looks like it's hiding something, the industry is hiding something. And until we know what it is they're hiding, we really can't have rational discussions about what the risks are and what the solutions to those risks should be. Close with a slogan, still part of that seventh takeaway point. I said that nothing good will happen for the gas industry, public acceptance-wise, until that disclosure issue is behind it. And I would just add in closing that the disclosure issue will not be resolved until CAS numbers are on the street. How many people know what a CAS number is? Steve, you're supposed to know that. All right, and I am going to stop. CAS number is Chemical Abstract Service Number. Every chemical in commerce has a unique number, and that's the Chemical Abstract Service Number. Without the Chemical Abstract Service Number, you cannot look up the chemical in the scientific literature. It hasn't been identified until we know the CAS number. Thanks.
I can just, you want me to just do it from here? I can do it from here. Okay. I assume that once I try that, it will, maybe that was a poor assumption. Okay. Well, there is a PowerPoint, trust me. But I don't know that it's going to be, here we go. There we go. Okay, the title of the talk today, my talk is going to be hydraulic fracturing operations, what is going on down there. But what we're getting together here to talk about is the promise and perils of hydraulic fracturing and what that means. And the first slide, let's talk about what I think is the promise. The promise is that it is America's shale gas resources allow us to utilize a fossil fuel that is clean burning. It emits 50% less CO2 than coal. Replacing coal with natural gas will result in significant reductions in other emissions, SOx, NOx, and mercury. And even though Scott had pointed out that fugitive emissions are an issue, a lot of companies are adopting what we call green completions that significantly reduce those fugitive emissions and are able to capture the gas from the very beginning rather than venting it. And another statistic that I think is very important here is that converting one waste disposal truck to natural gas from diesel is the energy reduction equivalent, pollution reduction equivalent, removing 325 cars from the road. It's also abundant. On a BTU equivalent basis, we have more natural gas here in the United States than Saudi Arabia has oil. Some people have said is up as much as twice as much. It's affordable. At the current NYMEX strip price on a BTU equivalent basis, it equates to about $20 per barrel oil. And currently right now, West Texas Intermediate, I think, is $84, $85 a barrel. So it's significantly less expensive. And it's American. It's American. The natural gas industry supports over 2.8 million jobs in the U.S. And if we continue to develop this resource, it will continue to expand the number of jobs that we do support. And that also has a very significant effect of enhancing our country's energy security by reducing our dependence on foreign oil. So what are the perils? Well, the current debate, as I see it, is I call it the perfect storm. And why is it the perfect storm? Because right now we have what I'll call certain environmental groups and activists that are waging a fear-based campaign that is not founded on good science or demonstrable facts. We have many in the natural gas industry that feels that it's good enough to say we've been doing this for 60 years, so leave us alone. Don't regulate us out of business. And that's the position they've been taking. We have proposed federal legislation that is trying to solve the issue with what I call a one-size-fits-all solution that, in my opinion, will do more harm than good. This natural gas and oil and gas exploration is inherently a local issue that needs to be dealt with by the states because the geology, hydrology, and other conditions are peculiar to each state. And to think that someone here in Washington knows better about what needs to be done in Pennsylvania or Colorado or Texas is a real tough sell as far as I'm concerned. And the last is public distrust and fear. The public is understandably fearful of what they don't know. And that fear is continually fed by misinformation about hydraulic fracturing. Also point out that there's a growing sense of distrust for the industry, primarily due to the backlash of the BP disaster and, as Scott had mentioned, the inordinate amount of time to resolve what most of the public believe is a fairly simple issue to resolve, and that is disclosure of the hydraulic fracturing fluids, what's in the fluids. Well, I think the problem, then, to summarize with the current debate, the problem is that it really fails to do what is necessary, and that is to identify what the real obstacles are to the responsible development of this very, very important resource, and come up with workable solutions for those obstacles. And with the remaining time, I'm going to focus on one of those issues that I think, more than any other, symbolizes the problem with this current debate, and that is protecting underground water resources and how we go about doing that. Really, there's four factors. Well integrity I've got here shows well integrity is the key. Scott mentioned something about that, and I think there are four factors I'm going to go through, hopefully rather quickly, to consider when assessing the integrity of a well and making sure that we do not allow any contamination of underground sources of drinking water. Here's a graphic that shows what the first factor is, and that's evaluating the stratigraphic confinement. In this instance, you'll see that this is an example of a horizontally fractured well in the Fayetteville Shale. You'll notice there's 4,000 feet of sediment between the formation that's being fractured and the usable fresh water. You also notice that you can't really see it from here, but I will tell you from running our cores that we cored through the bounding formation above the Morrow Shale and the Hinesville line below and identified different rock properties. And this is very, very important because one of the reasons why we haven't had an issue, anyone that's been able to point to one instance of contamination from hydraulic fracturing is because Mother Nature is our friend. We have, in this case, 4,000 feet of sediment crushing down on the zone that we're trying to fracture. And within that 4,000 feet, we have several different layers of rock that have different characteristics of the rock from what we are trying to fracture. And so what does this mean exactly? Well, as you evaluate the rock properties, if you believe what I'm saying, then you shouldn't have any fracture growth from the Fayetteville Shale either up into the Morrill Shale or down into the Hinesville line. And in fact, this is a microseismic evaluation of a fracturing event, and it shows exactly that. You have absolutely no growth of the fractures down into the Hinesville line because the Hinesville line had a frac gradient that was much greater than what it would take to fracture the Fayetteville Shale. And then in the transition zone between the Fayetteville Shale and the Morrill, you have a few fracture events there. That's because it's in the transition zone. But clearly, beyond that few 10 to 20 feet above the Fayetteville Shale, you have absolutely no fracture growth. The next thing that Scott had mentioned is well construction standards. And this will explain graphically a little bit about what Scott was mentioning. We have basically concentric barriers that help protect and isolate the freshwater aquifers from our target zone. Up at the very top is what we have called conductor pipe. That's usually about 30 to 60 feet of pipe that's put down initially to prevent the unconsolidated rock from falling into the wellbore as drilling takes place, and that is cemented all the way to the surface. Then, after we drill down below the deepest freshwater aquifers, we will install another set of pipe called surface casing, and again, we will cement that all the way up to the top. Then we'll drill down to our target formation, and in this case, what I'm showing you, because it's going to be important in a little bit to illustrate some issues as to what's really going on in gas migration. After we put the production casing in, we will cement that up to a point that is usually several hundred feet above either the shallowest producing zone or saltwater zone that may cause problems for freshwater aquifers. And so once we put that in place, and that's how it's constructed, then we will test the integrity of that well before we do any hydraulic fracturing. You can do a formation integrity test. You can do a cement bond log. You can do all sorts of tests to make sure this well construction is done properly. And as long as those the well construction standards are met, more times than not, we don't have any issues. So this is what it looks like if we have constructed the well properly. We have tested it, and you have, in this instance, this is an example, let's say, a Marcellus shale well. Marcellus shale will be the target producing zone. We have gas coming up the wellbore that gets separated and goes onto the pipeline. You'll see those red dots in the intermediate producing zone and the shallow producing zone represent shallow gas that we do not want to produce, but that can provide some problems, gas migration issues, if it's not properly, the well is not properly constructed and those zones aren't isolated. Here's an example of one of those problems. It's called cement channeling. When doing the cement job, you have two different bonds you need to be concerned about. The bond between the cement and the casing, and the bond between the casing and the formation. In this instance, you don't have a good bond between the formation and the cement, and gas is allowed to leak from that shallow producing zone up into the annulus. And then what happens is that gas continues to collect in the annulus until pressure builds up in the annulus, and then that gas seeks the most actually the path of least resistance, which almost all the time is what we call at the casing chute, the surface casing. So then the gas starts leaking out, and then it finds a pathway up into the freshwater aquifers. Many of the cases and we have analyzed every one of the cases that have been reported with respect to gas migration, and we have found that absolutely none of those has anything to do with the actual, as Scott put it, the actual hydraulic fracturing. It has to do with problems associated with usually a shallower formation that isn't properly cemented. And this is what happens. You have an annular overpressurization. The gas is allowed to migrate out, and that causes the problem. The the good news is that with a very inexpensive piece of equipment called a pressure relief valve, a gauge and pressure relief valve, this can be taken care of. Another way is a leak through the casing. As I mentioned, we need to determine both the internal and external mechanical integrity of this well is sufficient before we fracture that well. And as we do that, you would determine in this case that you had a hole in the casing. If you didn't, then you could have problems. And one of those problems is you have gas that travels up the wellbore and it goes out in through the hole in the casing into the annulus, overpressurizes the annulus again, and then you have gas migration. And then the last example I would have here is insufficient cement coverage. In this case, they just didn't get the cement up high enough to where it isolated that shallow producing zone. The gas again was allowed to migrate up the annulus. The pressure builds up, and then it finds again the path of least resistance, and then it migrates out into the freshwater aquifers. So the last of the 4 points is monitoring the frac job and the producing well. I think a lot of people may believe that that fracking is just a matter of just going down there and blasting the rock as hard as you can, and you step back and see what happens. In fact, there is a lot of science that goes into analyzing both the bounding formations and the target formation. It does not do any good for any of our companies to have fracture growth outside of the target formation. It is a waste of the energy. It also leaves it open to migration of fluids into the wellbore, which will damage the well. So we can tell, as we're conducting these operations, as long as everyone does it, this is possible, and as long as everyone is required to do it, if we monitor the pump pressure and the rate during the frac job, we can tell if we frac into an existing fracture or something like that, because we can see that on the readout. If we also monitor the annular pressures during and after the frac job, we can prevent any kind of gas migration issues. And if we do have a problem in which there's an aberrational pressure drop, then we know that we should terminate right then and take corrective action. Do a cement job, do a cement squeeze or something, put more cement in when it should be, and do not continue on unless that is taken care of.
Please turn off your BlackBerry. So that means it gets some kind of cycle. Okay. Please do not touch the microphone. I think I've got it now. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I think my role, you've heard a good set of descriptions about both the overview of the nature of the issues and the process of fracturing as well as the process of well construction. I think my role is to somewhat be the cynic over the political process that we're undergoing here as we talk about where our path forward may lie. I appreciate what Scott was saying about the work of the Environmental Defense Fund and its reach-out efforts to try to look for solutions to problems in the environmental area. I wish that was a more widely held attitude by many of the environmental industry, environmental organizations. I can also say that while industry is willing to try to operate and look for solutions, it has the same level of distrust for the process, I think, that many in the environmental community have. And finding a pathway between the two of them has been extremely difficult. And I believe that part of that is because there is a large debate going on here. And the large debate is over our future energy structure. There's a great number of members of the environmental community who have as their charter position the elimination of fossil fuels in the United States, or the world, if we can do it. And as a result, we tend to see these debates cast not as some skirmish over the chemicals that are used in the fracturing process or some battle over hydraulic fracturing, but much more as a war over the future of fossil energy, and in this case, natural gas. I think if you look at coal, if you look at oil, if you look at natural gas, you'll see in each of those areas there's a major confrontation going on. And in each of those areas there are reasons for it. We didn't see as much intensity on natural gas until the fracturing process really became as effective as it has become in opening up the types of shale gas formations that exist in the United States and in fact exist worldwide. And the reason for that is, until that point in time, natural gas was generally viewed as a declining fuel. It may be cleaner than coal. We can argue over how much. It may be more American than oil, but it was declining, and so it didn't draw the kind of animosity towards it that the other fossil fuels did. The advent of horizontal drilling and the use of hydraulic fracturing in shale gas changed that dynamic dramatically. It opened enormous American resources that can be available to us not for a decade but for 100 years or more. And as a result, it became a threat to the agenda of eliminating fossil fuels. So why did we suddenly see this debate become so intense with respect to chemicals? Because that really seems to be where the most harsh contest exists. We've looked, I think, Mark showed how the pathways of risk occur with respect to the fracturing process, and it's primarily through the wellbore. We know that there's technologies that can prevent that migration if they're properly applied. We know that there's regulations in place to require that those actions be taken. And we know that the industry doesn't want to lose the natural gas that it's producing, and it doesn't want to produce things that it shouldn't produce. So that those pieces are in place with respect to the fracturing process. The chemical issue then becomes a test, a mechanism to try to look for a pathway to weaken those arguments. It's an almost serendipitous event in many respects. If we go back and look at the debate in part over hydraulic fracturing in the context of the Safe Drinking Water Act, you will find that when that debate was occurring, initially there was a study that was done, an environmental impact statement that was done on a project, and in the appendix that was dealing with fracturing, a person who really didn't understand fossil fuels very much found that diesel was being used in the fracturing process at that time, and thought that if diesel was being used, then MTBE, which was a gasoline additive, might be present. And so suddenly the debate was around the idea that fracturing was introducing MTBE into your drinking water. It wasn't. Diesel doesn't have MTBE. So we had a major confrontation over that allegation. EPA went out and did a study to look at hydraulic fracturing. It, again, confirmed that MTBE wasn't involved. But what it did do when it was doing that was raise the question of whether diesel might be a problem in the fracturing process. Diesel was used principally as a solvent to allow the chemical additives that are in the fracturing process to be dispersed to the water-sand mixture. And there's no indication that the diesel was creating any kind of a problem with hydraulic fracturing, with groundwater. When EPA did its study, it found no incidents of problems associated with the diesel. But that wasn't good enough, so when it came back in its later versions of that, it started hypothesizing that if there was a problem with diesel, with fracturing, it would be the diesel. And it would be a problem because there's benzene and toluene and xylene that are naturally occurring in diesel. So the second dynamic that we saw in this debate was an emphasis on trying to get rid of diesel in the fracturing process. Initially that occurred with an agreement among the major fracturing companies that they wouldn't use diesel and hydraulic fracturing for coal bed methane operations. It then became a part of the final legislation that was passed that gave EPA jurisdiction over hydraulic fracturing under the Safe Drinking Water Act if diesel was used. And what that also led to was a realization that people can be scared of chemicals. If you give them enough fear, they can be responsive to it, and it subsequently has led to an aggressive effort to attack hydraulic fracturing throughout all the states where it's in play, and particularly in those states where it hasn't been used extensively, to create this aspect that the chemicals that are used in the fracturing process are now going to be pervasively in your drinking water, where there's no facts to support that. Scott mentioned at the end of his comments that nothing good would happen on this issue until we resolve the disclosure issue, and I think everyone recognizes it's going to have to be addressed. States have begun actively addressing the disclosure issue by initiating individual state efforts, as well as now the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission and the Groundwater Protection Council, two organizations of state regulators agreeing to develop a public registry that they will be implementing over the next several years to provide information on the chemicals that are used in the fracturing process. What will that tell us? I think if you look at the information that is available through the material safety data sheet process that is acquired as a part of OSHA information, principally with respect to exposure to chemicals for personnel purposes, that the vast, overwhelming majority of information that's needed to assess whether there's a chemical risk is available on those sheets. It may not be precise, but it is available. And if it's put in the context of the fracturing job, which is what the process for disclosure is moving toward, it will demonstrate that the amounts of chemicals, the types of chemicals that are there, are largely defined, and in the context of management, clearly if we can relate to how the wellbore protection is in place, that the risk of those chemicals is minimal. So why do we keep coming back to this issue over CAS numbers? Well, one of the things we're dealing with in this debate over chemical disclosure is who has the information and who has the legal capability to disclose it. The producer has basically information that they receive from the fracturing company that does the fracturing job. It tells them how much water they used, how much sand they used, what chemical additives they used. With the information on the chemical additives, they can get the MSDS sheets, and they know what chemicals are available based on those MSDS sheets. The fracturing company, by and large, gets that information from the chemical manufacturer. Chemical manufacturer may or may not disclose all of the information, all of the chemicals that are involved in the additive that it makes. So if the burden for disclosure is placed on the producer, and the producer doesn't have the information, all of the CAS number information that's there, then they can't perform that duty. And that cripples the entire capability to address the chemical disclosure issue. So it's a much more complicated chain of commerce issue than something that producers can instantly resolve. Producers can provide information. They are willing to provide information. Southwestern, I think, has been providing information on the chemicals that it's used. A number of my member companies have been providing information as well. And the state program will provide that in even greater amounts. And if it were truly analyzed and truly understood, it would answer the chemical disclosure issue without having to create the potential problem that the CAS number disclosure will generate and put at risk the ability to then convince the public that fracturing is safe. It's not a simple matter to deal with this issue, because once it is dealt with, it will be the first set aside and another one will be elevated. If you look at the dynamics within particularly the Natural Resources Defense Council, it has created an agenda of a half a dozen federal laws it wants to change. Solving the chemical issue on hydraulic fracturing will not end that agenda, and we will be fighting another different fight with respect to what I, as I said before, believe is a war over the future of natural gas in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Did a great job for the time. I had promised the panel members that they would each get a chance to ask a brief question or make a comment responding to what the others had said. So I think we'll just continue on if you want to.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I think what I'm about to do is prove that until the disclosure issue is behind us, that we're not really going to make progress on the real issues, because I'm going to talk again about the disclosure issue. There are several reasons why chemicals need to be disclosed and why they need to be disclosed at the CAS number level, subject to legitimate protections for intellectual property, confidential business information. But subject to those protections, we need CAS number information in order for agencies to properly do investigations of complaints, contamination. We need it to guide research priorities. If you look at the 200 some odd chemicals in the New York EIS and compare it against the 21 toxic databases I referred to, the thing that becomes most apparent is not what we know, but how much we don't know. And it's expensive to do research. So we need to know in detail what chemicals are being used in order for society not to waste money studying things that don't need to be studied, and to get our priorities straight. We need the information, as I mentioned earlier, to have a rational discussion about how much risk there is. And the information is going to be needed if the public is to have any input on industry efforts to reduce the toxicity of these mixtures, to substitute less toxic things for more toxic things. If that's going to be done with any transparency, then the information needs to be available. It's needed for state agencies, at least in the Marcellus region, to know how to write surface discharge permits. You know, what chemicals need limits, and I mean, what should those limits be? You got to know what the chemical is to do that. And then finally, the public wants to know. This issue has gotten really, really big. It's clear the industry is hiding something, and they simply need to disclose it in order to put that out. Again, everything I just said does not take away from the fact that there are good reasons in some, but not all circumstances, to protect people's intellectual property.
Mark, did you have anything to add?
No, I would just maybe enhance one point that I want to make sure that if there was one takeaway, and that is the most frustrating thing I think for myself individually, and for really I believe the country, is that this debate is just going sideways, and it's not doing anyone any good. I mean, if we're talking about the ultimate customer for all of us, I mean, if it's the environmental groups who are concerned about the environment and the public and protecting them, or it's the natural gas industry that wants to prove that natural gas is a very key component to a clean energy future, then we need to do a better job of how we debate these issues. And it's a shame because things like shockumentaries that come out and other things that are viewed as the truth, and the public doesn't know any more than that because they're not hearing enough of the debate that actually looks at the issues, looks at the obstacles, say, yeah, that is an issue, let's talk about how to resolve it. Instead, they are fed a tremendous amount of misinformation, and that doesn't help anyone. It doesn't help. Certainly it doesn't help the natural gas industry. It doesn't help the public because they have the right to make an informed decision. The only way they can make an informed decision is to be getting the facts and getting them straight. And the biggest disappointment I have in all this is that I think that everyone involved in this debate should take a look and say, can't we do this a little better?
Let me respond to a couple of points that I heard Scott make, and that is two things I'd like to discuss. One is that there are two different disclosure debates that go on. One is what information is needed for the regulators to be able to make sound decisions, and the other is what information needs to be made public as a general matter. I don't think anyone disputes that the regulators need to have the information that they need on chemicals and the mixtures of chemicals in order to make sound regulatory judgments about the management of the risk associated with the entire process. But that's a very different debate than providing information on a broad public scale that is not understood by the general public and which is being used in many respects to try to frighten them. The second point I would make is that what we need to be focusing on is much more the context of managing the environmental risk. And it's a part of that is a recognition that the oil and gas business forever has always presented a certain level of risk. Oil is not something you want in your drinking water. Natural gas liquids are not things you want in your drinking water. Produced water is not something you want in your drinking water. So in the broad context, we've been managing those risks and needing to manage them and evolving our management of them for decades. That process also manages the risks associated with the chemicals and the flowback water from hydraulic fracturing, and I don't think anyone questions the need to be able to continue to do that properly. The fact that we've been diverted on this large debate over chemicals is really the result of a very orchestrated effort to try to terrify large numbers of people in the United States.
Thank you. We can go back and forth, which we may do at lunch, but I want to give people in the audience a chance to ask a question. We have microphones, so if you raise your hand if you want to ask a question, but wait till you get the microphone, please, and give us your name and any affiliation, because we are broadcasting this and it will be taped for posting on the website within 24 hours. So, we're ready. Have one way in the back.
RTTV. And I just actually wanted to continue this discussion a little bit. Something Scott said, and my question is for Mr. Fuller. Something that Scott said earlier was when you don't disclose things, even if you don't really have anything to hide, it gives the public perception that you do. Can you just speak to that? You were talking a little bit about the public not understanding those chemicals, but if you could just speak to that a little bit in terms of making this debate go forward.
Well, one of the great challenges that we've got whenever we're dealing with chemicals, just like when we're dealing with energy generally, is that the general population's level of understanding of what they're dealing with is probably not as strong as it needs to be. Most people didn't really love their chemistry class in high school, and most people didn't take it when they got to college. So whenever you provide people with just a long list of chemicals and describe them as a toxic soup of information or of process, it creates a natural tendency to fear. And there's been an enormous amount of money spent trying to create exactly that kind of a reaction. One of the things that we hope that the Groundwater Protection Council Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission effort will produce is a registry of information that will put all of this in a proper context so that people understand not only what the chemicals are, but what the relative perspective of them is in the overall volume of fluids that are in play, as well as how the risk is managed to keep those chemicals, as well as anything else that's being produced, from endangering their health.
Just real quick, I wanted to say I participate in both Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission and Groundwater Protection Council. Very supportive of the effort that Lee's referring to. It is not a substitute for mandatory disclosure of chemicals. It's a very good way of disseminating to the public what information is brought forward, but it's not a substitute for actual disclosure.
Another question? Yes.
Good afternoon. Ben Salisbury with FBR. I was wondering if maybe, some people would say that the biggest threat to the natural gas industry isn't regulation, it's oversupply. And if that has any truth at all, why not double down on the regulatory costs and reduce the supply and drive up the price? What's the big concern about increasing the casing, requiring certification of cement bond logs, all of these things that will raise price, and the $4 gas environment doesn't seem like a terrible idea. Where's the resistance to that come from?
Well, I'm not sure that, as you say, doubling down on regulatory costs are going to really increase price. I mean, it's your price. We're price takers, not price makers. So whatever the price is, it is. And what it would, one of the biggest problems is that if it ends up, just pricing less gas out of the market, then eventually you might have an increase, but it would be an artificial increase in price, not one that's really set by true supply and demand. The other thing would be that I wouldn't want. I mean, there are probably some enhancements to regulation that can be made that are meaningful, and certainly we're always looking at those. But I wouldn't want to give the public a false sense of security that now all of a sudden we're spending twice as much on, running cement bond logs all the time or doing this and that. So now you're really, really safe, when the benefit associated with that isn't really what you would think it was. It'd give them a false sense of security, I believe.
Just in a somewhat different perspective, I think that my membership would generally be looking at, does it improve the protection against environmental risk? We're not going to be endorsing something that is simply a cost for cost's sake if it doesn't improve the protection in a meaningful way. Our general assessment of the regulatory structure that is in place, particularly with respect to managing protection against groundwater, is that it is sound, and it has been sound for decades. There are always ways to improve it. When the Groundwater Protection Council, for example, did its assessment of groundwater regulations a year or so ago, it came back generally concluding that the regulatory structure was in good shape. It asks for some additional information. It asked for better information on best management practices that were used in the fracturing and casing and cementing and surface management of drilling, as well as more particularly focused on hydraulic fracturing. It asked for enhanced review process of the regulatory system. Both of those things have been addressed since then. The American Petroleum Institute, which does primarily industry standards work, has produced, I think, now 4 new guidance documents on best management practices associated with things like cementing and casing, surface management of fracturing fluids, and some other areas. A group called Stronger, which is the state review of oil and natural gas environmental regulations, a group comprised of state regulators, industry, and environmentalists, revised its review process to bring in new reviews of the hydraulic fracturing regulatory systems in the state, and those reviews are now underway. I believe Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Louisiana have been reviewed, and I think Colorado is scheduled. So there are a lot of opportunities for industry and states, and environmentalists to look at ways to improve the management of the risk. That's a different challenge than to debate over whether we're going to focus our entire attention on things like chemical disclosure, or whether we can figure out a way to walk through that process and get people information that they need to understand what their risk is.
One more over here.
Hi there, Alex Drake, Alliance for Climate Protection. Several of the stories that came out about health risks were around the treatment and disposal end of the process. Lack of both technology and facilities to effectively treat a lot of the water and chemicals being used. I was wondering if maybe any of you could speak to what's being done on that end.
So, in most of the country, produced water and the stuff that comes up with the produced water is taken to deep disposal wells that are regulated under Safe Drinking Water Act's underground injection control system. In my opinion, that's the best thing to do with produced water. Unfortunately, the infrastructure for such wells in the Marcellus is almost non-existent. There's several tens of thousands, maybe 25,000 maybe it is, these disposal wells for oil and gas waste nationwide. The last I heard, there were 6 in Pennsylvania.
There's 145,000.
145,000 Class 2 wells,
in the United
most of
States.
which are injection wells.
Yeah.
So I think the population out of that 125 of disposal wells is either 25 or 40. Anyway, lots, and that's where the most oil and gas waste goes, and that's where it ideally would go. But in the Marcellus, for geologic reasons largely, and maybe partly historical reasons, there's only a handful. There's 6 or so in Pennsylvania. Only one of them, I believe, is a commercial well available to other people. So that's forcing industry to innovate on recycling, and it also creates pressure for surface discharges. And essentially, to the extent they can't be recycled or taken to one of these handful of disposal wells, people are going to need to discharge it somewhere. And then there's no established precedents onshore U.S. on how exactly you ought to design such a discharge permit. What needs to be regulated there, and what are the health-based and technology-based limits.
I just mentioned it, with respect to our Fayetteville Shale project, we currently recycle 100% of our flowback water. We are trying to get to that point in our Marcellus operations. It's a little more difficult there because the chloride contents are much higher. But I'll just say this overall with respect to water disposal and water handling, that is a technical issue that I believe our industry and just Americans in general, it's a perfect solution for technology, and it's in the process of being solved because it can be done. It's technically feasible, and now it's a matter of finding out what's the best technology in which area.
I just want to make the point that while surface discharges are something that have to be considered, they are regulated under the Clean Water Act. And so to discharge a surface water, you either have to take it to a treatment facility that has a permit, or you have to get a permit yourself. There aren't specific effluent guidelines, which is the process for designing permit discharges under the Clean Water Act for produced water from shale operations, but there is within the structure of the Clean Water Act a mechanism called best professional judgment, which provides the permit writers with the ability to make judgments about what kind of technologies are needed before they will allow the discharge. And they have the right to determine the nature of the water that they're going to be dealing with under current law to determine what kind of pollutants they need to manage.
I'm going to take the host prerogative of asking the last question, and it's going to be sort of my distillation of what I think is the common ground here, and the question will be, did I get it right? As I understand it, the debate on hydraulic fracturing has little to do with the actual fracturing part, that's where the horizontal drilling, that's not where the problems are arising, but rather from escape of chemicals or water that's polluted or whatever in the vertical part of the well that's not unique to hydraulic fracturing but would be present in all the wells, and are problems that the drilling industry has been addressing for quite some time, with the addition that we now have some additional chemicals to worry about. Am I close? Or did I not?
Yeah, you're close. You're
Close enough.
Close enough. Okay, well, very good. Okay. Well then, I want to thank the panel very, very much. It was a wonderful presentation.